Remember when one angry Chicago kid rolled into a small town, met a preacher with a steel spine, a rebellious preacher's daughter, and a best friend who danced like he was being attacked by the floor? Well, Footloose gave us Kevin Bacon as Ren McCormick, Laurie Singer as Ariel Moore, John Lithgow as Reverend Shaw Moore, and Chris Penn as Willard in a movie that somehow turned teen frustration, church politics, tractors, and warehouse gymnastics into pure 1980s magic. The movie hit theaters in 1984, and it absolutely became one of those cable and VHS staples that felt like it was always on. Today we're going to dig into 15 wild and wonderful facts that you didn't know about Footloose. The casting near misses, the behind-the-scenes chaos, the real town that inspired it, and the details that make this movie even stranger than we remembered. But before we lace up those dancing shoes, hit like, subscribe to Remember When, and share this video with a friend who still hears Footloose and immediately starts doing shoulder moves like it's 1984. Now, let's get into the countdown. Number 15. The director who destroyed a studio almost made Footloose. In 1980, the movie Heaven's Gate bombed, like really bombed. So much so that it helped bring down an entire studio. And director Michael Cimino almost got his hands on Footloose. Heaven's Gate cost around $44 million and grossed roughly $3.5 million domestically. Ugh. United Artists was sold to MGM shortly after. The damage was that bad. And yet, when Paramount needed a director for Footloose, somebody in charge thought Cimino might be the guy. So Paramount built protections into his contract to keep that budget under control, but it didn't work. Cimino hated the script and wanted to rewrite it for an additional $200,000 to $250,000. Producer Craig Zadan later said that Cimino's version leaned much darker than the crowd-pleasing entertainment that the producers had in mind. Dean Pitchford recalled Cimino pushing for bigger, more grandiose setups, exactly the kind of thing that made the studio nervous after the Heaven's Gate debacle. Herbert Ross, who had a track record of making movies that people actually wanted to see, stepped in when his other project was postponed, and that version became the Footloose that we know. This movie was one bad studio decision away from turning into a brooding art house statement about small-town repression instead of the box office dance phenomenon that it became. Number 14, the real town that banned dancing. Now, Footloose didn't make the plot up out of thin air. There really was a small town with an actual ban on dancing. No prom, no school dances, nothing. Elmore City, Oklahoma is its name. And the ban on public dancing dated all the way back to around 1898, before Oklahoma was even a state. The thinking was that dancing led to drinking, and drinking led to carousing, and carousing led to a matter of all things the community wanted no part of. It was preached from the pulpit, it was baked into local culture, and enforced hard enough that even movements that resembled dancing were banned in school. For over 80 years, it just wasn't allowed. And then in 1980, a group of high school students decided that they had had enough. They went straight to the school board and argued for the right to hold a senior prom. Not exactly a rebellion with pitchforks, but in Elmore City, this was basically the plot of Footloose playing out in real time. After a lot of debate and some very serious concerns about what dancing could lead to, the town finally approved it, with one condition: no suggestive dancing. All right. So the movie pulled that straight from real life. And the wild part? A tiny Los Angeles Times item about Elmore City lifting its ban is what inspired screenwriter Dean Pitchford to write Footloose in the first place. Number 13, the guy who wrote every single lyric. Dean Pitchford wrote the screenplay, and then he wrote the lyrics for every single original song on the soundtrack. That's right, Footloose, Let's Hear It for the Boys, Holding Out for a Hero, Almost Paradise, all 9 songs. Great songs, too. Different composers and different artists, but one lyricist holding the whole thing together. And that was intentional. Pitchford has said that he felt the voices on the soundtrack needed to be extensions of the characters in the film. The singer of Footloose had to feel like the inner voice of Ren. The songs had to tell the same story that the script was telling, and the only way to guarantee that was to write all of it himself. That's not how Hollywood usually works, right? You got screenwriters that write scripts and lyricists writing songs, so keeping both jobs in one set of hands across 9 songs in a full feature film, that's the kind of thing that sounds exhausting just to read about, but it's also why the movie feels as cohesive as it does. The music and the story aren't just compatible, they're speaking the same language, because, well, they came from the same guy. Number 12, the movie started out as Cheek to Cheek. Now, of course, Footloose sounds like the perfect title now, but early on, the movie was floating around with a much less rebellious name, Cheek to Cheek. Now, if that sounds less like a defiant teen drama and more like something that your grandparents slow dance to, you're not wrong. That's actually the point. Screenwriter Dean Pitchford has said that he chose it as a dummy title, something that was so intentionally awful that nobody at the studio would fall in love with it and try to make it permanent. It was a placeholder, a decoy, named after an Irving Berlin ballroom standard that had absolutely nothing to do with angry teenagers and small-town rebellion.
Dancing cheek to cheek.
The title didn't exactly scream small-town uprising, so Pitchford got to work. He spent days filling yellow legal pads with alternatives, dozens of them, until on day 2 he wrote down Footloose and Fancy Free, and then he looked at it, crossed out the last 3 words, and he had his answer.
Yeah, boy.
He landed on Footloose, not because of some deep symbolic meaning, but because it looked good on a billboard and would sell itself from across the street. And about 3 months before filming began, when Paramount heard Kenny Loggins lay down that title track, the decision was officially done. Cheek to cheek, it sounds more like a ballroom lesson. Footloose, that sounds like trouble. Pitchford knew exactly what he was doing. Number 11, Footloose almost had a completely different cast. The cast of Footloose was basically a game of Hollywood musical chairs, and almost nobody ended up in the seat that you'd expect. Before Kevin Bacon landed the role of Rem, Tom Cruise was the first choice. The producers loved what they had seen from him in Risky Business, specifically that underwear dance scene. But he was already locked into all the right moves, and he had to pass. Rob Lowe wanted that part badly enough to audition 3 times, and he might have gotten it. He had the dancing ability, he had the look, but then he threw himself into a knee slide at the end of his final audition and blew out his knee right in front of the producers. That was it. And then you had Christopher Atkins, the Blue Lagoon guy, who sources say was actually cast in the role before showing up to his first meeting visibly hungover. The producers took one look at him and then quietly moved on. John Travolta was offered the role and then turned it down. After Saturday Night Fever and Grease made him the biggest dancing star on the planet, the last thing that he wanted to do was another dancing movie. So he passed on Footloose to chase grittier dramatic roles instead. Now over on the Ariel side, Madonna auditioned. Daryl Hannah turned the role down to do Splash. The list of actresses who passed on or were considered for Ariel, it reads like a Hollywood yearbook. And as for Kevin Bacon, Herbert Ross had to screen his earlier film Diner just to convince the producers to take a chance on him. 30 seconds into the screen test, and he had the part. Number 10, Kevin Bacon needed backup. Kevin Bacon signed on to Footloose without fully realizing just how much dancing the role actually required. Once production started, it became clear that this wasn't casual moving around to music. It was full choreography plus gymnastics. So Bacon trained hard. He spent weeks working with choreographers and grinding through gymnastics practice. But even that wasn't enough for what the warehouse scene needed. Now, Bacon later revealed that the scene had essentially 4 versions of him on screen. He had a dance double, a stunt double, and 2 gymnastics doubles. Peter Tram handled the dance work. Chuck Gaylord stepped in for the bigger gymnastics moves. And Bacon was pretty furious about it. He later compared it to a starting pitcher getting pulled from a game before finishing the job. Nobody wants to be told they can't get the guy out. And here's the part that makes it even better. He was told to never mention the dance double in interviews. So for years, the warehouse scene just lived in pop culture as pure Kevin Bacon. But it wasn't. It was Kevin Bacon, Peter Tram, Chuck Gaylord, and 2 other guys all wearing the same outfit, and somehow nobody noticed for decades. Number 9, Kevin Bacon broke out in hives for one scene. Now, for all the dancing, shouting, and warehouse rage in Footloose, the scene that nearly wrecked Kevin Bacon wasn't physical at all. It was the town council speech. Now, Bacon has said that he has a real fear of public speaking. And when it came time to film Ren pleading for the right to dance, his nerves got so bad that he actually broke out in hives. Not metaphorically, actual hives. The solution wasn't breathing exercises or a wellness coach or a quiet 5 minutes in the trailer. According to Bacon, director Herbert Ross took one look at him, handed him half a Valium, and told him to calm down. Bacon did the scene, the hives went away, and the movie got one of its most emotional moments. Number 8, the ending that you remember, that wasn't the original one. The prom ending that closes out Footloose, the one that feels like the whole movie is finally exhaling, it almost didn't exist. The original ending had Ren shout, "Let's dance," and then a brief moment of movement, and then the whole thing melting into slow motion. Glitter falling from the sky, everyone swaying, very dramatic, very artsy. And test audiences, they hated it. The reaction was essentially, we invested all this time and we don't even get to see the kids dance? So the studio scrapped the slow motion glitter idea, and they brought the cast back almost a year later. They hired LA dancers, created new choreography, and reshot the entire ending from scratch. The reshoot also solved a mystery that fans have been puzzling over for years. Why does Sarah Jessica Parker essentially vanish from the final dance scene? She played Rusty throughout the whole film and then just isn't there at the end. Well, the answer is simple. She wasn't available when they came back a year later to reshoot it. Hey, quick pause. What's your favorite song from Footloose? Well, drop it in the comments, and while you're down there, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the movies that we grew up with. Number 7, John Lithgow lied to a real minister for research. Now, John Lithgow took his role as Reverend Shaw Moore very seriously, uncomfortably seriously, as it turns out. Now, Lithgow's not a religious person and has never been part of a religious community growing up. So to understand how a small-town minister thinks and talks and counsels people, he just went straight to the source. He found an Assembly of God minister in the Yellow Pages. He called him up and then posed as someone that was genuinely seeking spiritual guidance. He later admitted that he felt like, in his own words, a total hypocrite, a snake in the grass. But the conversation gave him exactly what he needed. The tone, the authority, the quiet conviction of someone who truly believes that he's protecting his community. So those calm, controlled sermons that Lithgow delivers, they were built, at least in part, on a phone call that the minister on the other end thought was completely real. The irony? Well, after all that commitment, Lithgow spent years brushing Footloose off as his teeny bopper movie. But that changed when a guest actor on Third Rock from the Sun pulled him aside and told him that showing the film to a strict Baptist minister father had softened the man's views on dancing. He was the first of 6 siblings allowed to go to prom, all because of that movie. Lithgow said that he never looked at it the same way again. Number 6, Kenny Loggins had a broken rib when he wrote Footloose. The song that defined Footloose almost sounds like pure adrenaline. Big energy, big chorus, impossible to sit still. But behind the scenes, it was written by 2 guys who could barely function. Kenny Loggins was recovering from a broken rib. Dean Pitchford had strep throat, a 101 fever, and was secretly spraying his throat with Chloraseptic between sessions so that Loggins wouldn't find out how sick he was. Loggins was about to leave for Asia. They had a deadline, and neither one of them was stopping. Both were on medication, both were miserable, and somehow that's when they wrote Footloose. It's not exactly the origin story that you'd expect. And yet, they produced one of the most upbeat, high-energy songs of the entire decade. A track that went to number 1 and became permanently tied to the movie. Number 5, Chris Penn's dancing was actually wrestling. Not everyone in Footloose showed up ready to dance, and Chris Penn was the clearest example of that. Penn, who played Willard, wasn't a dancer, so when it came time for his big learning to dance moment, the choreography had to be built around what he could actually do. And what he could do was wrestle. Choreographer Lynn Taylor Corbett tapped into Penn's wrestling experience and built his movement around that. Grappling, balance, physical control. The whole scene was constructed to make it look like dancing while being rooted in something completely different. And that's why his scene feels different from everything else in the movie. No, it's not smooth, it's not polished. It's kind of awkward, aggressive, a little all over the place, and it works perfectly for the character. Willard wasn't suddenly a great dancer. He was just a guy figuring it out, using whatever moves he had. Number 4, the soundtrack became bigger than the movie. Footloose had a monster soundtrack, one of my personal favorites, which makes it all the more surprising that it almost didn't exist. When Paramount first heard the rough mixes, they panicked. The year before, the Flashdance soundtrack had been a massive hit built on electronic sounds, and the studio wanted something closer to that. Footloose sounded too different, too old-fashioned. They pushed back. Pitchford and the team held their ground. Columbia Records heard the same rough mixes and immediately knew that they had something. Now, of course, Columbia was right, and Paramount was very, very wrong. The soundtrack knocked Michael Jackson's Thriller out of the top spot on the Billboard album chart and stayed at number 1 for 10 weeks. It spun off 6 top 40 hits and produced 2 number 1 singles, Kenny Loggins' Footloose and Denise Williams' Let's Hear It for the Boy. Both received Oscar nominations for Best Original Song. By the end of 1984, the album had sold over 9 million copies in the United States alone. Now, people went to see Footloose for Kevin Bacon, the dancing, and the small-town rebellion, but somewhere along the way, the soundtrack stopped being part of the movie and became its own thing entirely. Number 3, Footloose didn't stay in the 80s. Now, most movies get their moment, they cash their check, and then quietly fade into cable reruns. But Footloose had other plans. The movie was such a durable hit that eventually it jumped from the screen to Broadway, where Footloose the musical opened in 1998 and ran for 709 performances. Pitchford wrote the Broadway book himself and collaborated on 9 new songs for the stage version. The man who put Footloose on paper spent the better part of 2 decades making sure it outlasted him. And it did. The story about a town banning dancing eventually became a stage musical where people paid Broadway prices to watch that same town learn not to ban dancing, which, if you think about it, is exactly the kind of thing that Reverend Moore would have had strong feelings about. But then, because Hollywood never met a successful 80s movie it didn't want to revisit, Footloose came back as a 2011 remake from Paramount Pictures. New cast, new decade, same basic message. The remake even kept 6 of Pitchford's original songs, and Blake Shelton covered the title track, which is either a perfectly reasonable creative choice or a crime against Kenny Loggins, depending on who you ask. I don't mind it. But Footloose became the kind of property that Hollywood keeps pulling back out of the closet every couple decades to see if it still fits. And guess what? It still fits. Number 2, Kevin Bacon went undercover at a real high school. Now, before Kevin Bacon could play a Chicago kid dropped into a small-town school, he figured he'd better know what that actually felt like. So he enrolled himself undercover for a day at Provo High School in Utah, which gets funnier when you remember that he was 24 at the time. The principal was in on it. Nobody else was. Bacon told classmates that he was from Philadelphia. That's his real hometown, just in case anyone started asking questions. And to really sell the city kid look, he wore a skinny tie, convinced that it would make him come across as cool and edgy, but it did not. The second he walked in, kids made fun of his tie, his hair, his clothes. Bigger guys cornered him in the bathroom. He later called the whole thing the world's dumbest ride-along. And by the end of the day, all he wanted was a bar. But here's the part that makes it worth it. One student stepped up and defended him from the bullies, which is almost exactly what happens to Ren in the movie. Bacon said the day had a very, very profound effect on his performance. And honestly, it shows. Number 1, before the movie, Kevin Bacon was already Footloose. And now for the kind of coincidence that sounds made up, but isn't. Long before Kevin Bacon became the face of Footloose, he was just a 15-year-old kid in Philadelphia playing drums in a band. And the name of that band? Footloose. Well, technically it was Chet Brown and Footloose, and then Jet Brown and Footloose, but look, you get the idea. Bacon had talked about it publicly, and he's been pretty clear that he didn't read it as some cosmic sign. But the rest of us, we're allowed to think whatever we want about that. So when he landed the role that would define his career, he wasn't just starring in Footloose, he was sort of returning to it. Sometimes Hollywood casting feels completely random, and sometimes it just feels like the universe was just connecting the dots all along. And there you have it, everyone. 15 weird facts that you didn't know about Footloose. Which one surprised you the most? Which one did we miss? Well, tell us in the comments. And hey, if you like this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps YouTube show this video to more retro movie fans just like you. And until next time, this is Remember When.